The rope creaked twice before it held, and that was the sound Irene Langston would carry with her for the rest of her life. She was 14 years old on the October morning her father hanged Thomas Ford from the old cottonwood behind the livery stable in Concho Springs, Texas, and she never forgot the way the leaves came down around his boots like they, too, were trying to look away. Silas Langston stood tall in his sheriff's coat, his silver star catching the pale morning light, and he read the charges in a voice that did not shake even once. Cattle rustling. The murder of Ezra Combs, ranch hand for the Voss spread. The town had gathered before sunrise, drawn by torches and whispered rumor, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge east of town, 20 men had already decided what was going to happen, and no judge from Fort Worth was going to arrive in time to stop it. Irene remembered Thomas Ford's face more than she remembered anything else about that morning. He was young, no older than 20, with sandy hair plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the cold, and his eyes kept finding hers in the crowd as though she were the only person there who might still believe him. "I never touched Ezra Combs," he had said, and his voice cracked on the name. "I swear it before God. Somebody put that knife in my saddlebag. Somebody wanted it to look like I'd done it." Nobody wanted to hear it. Garrett Voss, the richest rancher in 3 counties, stood near the front with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, and when Thomas Ford looked at him and said, "You know I didn't do this, Voss, you know it," the older man had only turned his head and spit into the dust. Irene had been standing beside her mother, who was already gone by the following spring from a fever that took half the women in town that winter, and she remembered gripping her mother's sleeve so hard her knuckles ached. She remembered begging in a small voice that nobody heeded, "Papa, wait, please wait. What if he's telling true?" But Silas Langston did not wait. The town wanted blood for Ezra Combs, and the evidence, thin as it was, pointed at Thomas Ford, and there was no telegraph wire fast enough and no patience left in Concho Springs for waiting on a circuit judge who might not arrive for another 6 weeks. Silas nodded to the men holding the rope, and the trapdoor beneath Thomas Ford's boots fell away, and the crowd made a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a wail, something low and terrible that Irene heard in her dreams for years afterward. She watched her father hang an innocent man. She did not know it for certain that morning, not with the clean certainty of proof, but she knew it in the marrow of her bones, in the way a child knows thunder is coming before the sky turns black. She knew it in the desperate honesty of Thomas Ford's eyes, and she knew it in the way Garrett Voss could not quite meet anyone's gaze afterward, and she knew it in the sick feeling that sat in her stomach like a stone for the rest of that year, and the year after that, and every year that followed until she was a grown woman with a life of her own to answer for. That night after the crowd had dispersed and the cottonwood tree stood empty and stark against the darkening sky, Irene had asked her father the only question that mattered. "Are you certain, Papa? Are you certain it was him?" Silas Langston had looked at his daughter for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that she did not yet have the years to name. Doubt, perhaps, or the beginning of a guilt that would follow him the way her own guilt would follow her. "The evidence said so," he had answered quietly. "A man has to trust the evidence, Irene. A sheriff can't be waiting on feelings." "But what if the evidence was wrong?" He had not answered her. He had only turned away and gone to sit alone on the porch with a bottle of whiskey he did not usually touch, and Irene had gone to bed that night with the sound of the rope creaking in her ears, and she had made herself a promise in the dark, the kind of promise a child makes without understanding the weight of it. "Someday," she thought, "I will find out the truth, and if he was innocent, I will spend my whole life making it right." She was 14 years old, and she did not yet know how long a life could be, or how much of it that single promise would come to fill. The years that followed moved the way years do in a small frontier town, slow in the living of them and fast in the looking back. Concho Springs grew a little, added a mercantile and a proper church with a bell that had come all the way from San Antonio, and the cottonwood tree behind the livery stable was cut down within 2 years because no one could stand the sight of it, though the stump remained, gray and silent, a scar on the earth that the town walked around without speaking of. Irene's mother died the following spring, and Irene grew up faster than most girls her age, keeping her father's house and learning to bake bread and mend shirts, and keep her own counsel in a household that had grown quiet with grief and guilt in equal measure. Silas Langston did not speak of Thomas Ford again, not for years, but Irene noticed the way he sometimes stood at the window at night and looked toward the empty patch of ground behind the livery, and she noticed the gray that came early into his beard, and she understood, without either of them saying it aloud, that the hanging had cost him something he could never quite get back. But Irene did not forget her promise. She was careful about it, the way a person is careful with a coal they mean to keep alive without letting anyone see the fire. She listened at doorways when the old men gathered at the mercantile to talk about the old days. She asked careful questions of anyone who had known Ezra Combs, the man Thomas Ford had supposedly killed, and she learned slowly, over the course of years, that Ezra Combs had been found with a bullet in his back near the north fence of the Voss Range, and that the knife in Thomas Ford's saddlebag had never actually been tested against the wound, because there had been no doctor in Concho Springs skilled enough to do such testing, and no one inclined to wait for one to be sent for. She learned, too, that Thomas Ford had been a homesteader, a young man who had staked a claim on 40 acres along Cottonwood Creek that happened to sit directly between Garrett Voss's herds and the only reliable water source for 10 miles in any direction. She learned that Voss had offered to buy the claim twice, and that Thomas Ford had refused both times, and that within a month of the second refusal, Ezra Combs was dead, and Thomas Ford was swinging from a cottonwood tree with the whole town cheering his death. She kept these things folded inside herself like pressed flowers in a book, fragile things she was not yet strong enough or old enough to bring into the light. She was, after all, still a girl in a sheriff's house, and Garrett Voss was still the richest man in 3 counties, and there was no proof yet, only a shape of suspicion that fit too neatly to be entirely coincidence. By the time Irene turned 18, in the spring of 1879, she had become known around Concho Springs as a careful, quiet young woman with steady hands and a habit of asking questions that seemed, on the surface, like idle curiosity. She helped at the church, she kept books for the mercantile on Saturdays, and she had turned down 2 marriage proposals from perfectly reasonable young men because something in her chest had never stopped whispering that her life was not yet free to be given away, not until an old debt had been paid. She did not know that the debt was about to walk back into town on a bay gelding, dust-covered and tired, with the same sandy-colored hair as the brother he had lost. Joseph Ford arrived in Concho Springs on a Tuesday afternoon in June, when the heat lay heavy over the town like a wool blanket nobody could shrug off. He had spent 4 years working cattle drives out of Abilene and further north into Kansas, sending money home to no one in particular, because there was no one left to send it to, and he had spent those same 4 years turning over in his mind, again and again, the last letter his brother Thomas had ever written him. The letter had arrived 2 months after Thomas was already dead, delayed in the mail the way letters sometimes were in that country, and it had described, in Thomas's plain and careful hand, a rancher named Voss who kept making offers on the homestead and would not take no for an answer, and a growing unease that Thomas could not quite put a name to. Joseph had read that letter until the paper wore thin at the folds, and he had come to Concho Springs at last, because a man could only run from a thing for so long before the running itself became a kind of cowardice. He rode in past the church and the mercantile and the saloon with its faded paint, and he noticed, the way a man notices a missing tooth, that there was no cottonwood tree behind the livery stable anymore, only a gray stump surrounded by weeds that no one had bothered to clear. He found a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Prout, and it was there, on his second evening in town, that he first laid eyes on Irene Langston. She was carrying a basket of mending down the main street when he saw her dark hair pinned up beneath a straw bonnet, her dress simple and sun-faded but neat, and there was something in the set of her shoulders, something watchful and unyielding, that made him look twice. He did not know her name yet. He did not know that she was the daughter of the man who had signed his brother's death with a nod of the head. He only knew that she looked at him for a moment longer than a stranger usually looked at another stranger, as though she were trying to place him, or perhaps trying to place a resemblance she could not yet name. It was Mrs. Pruitt who told him over a supper of beans and cornbread exactly whose daughter that had been. "That's Irene Langston," the widow said, passing him the plate of butter. "Sheriff Langston's girl. Good girl, keeps to herself mostly, does for the church and the mercantile. Lost her mother young, poor thing, had to grow up faster than most." Joseph set down his fork. "Langston," he repeated. "The sheriff. He's been sheriff here a long while then. Going on 15 years now. Why, you got business with him?" Joseph looked at his plate for a long moment before he answered. "I might," he said. "I had a brother once lived out along Cottonwood Creek, name of Thomas Ford." The widow's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and something careful came into her face, the look of a woman who has just remembered a grief she had hoped a stranger would not bring up at her supper table. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "Best let that lie, son. Nothing good ever comes of digging up old graves." "He wasn't guilty," Joseph said, and his voice was steady, though something in his chest had gone tight and cold. "I don't care how long ago it was. He wasn't guilty, and I mean to find out who was." Mrs. Pruitt did not answer that. She only reached over and patted his hand once, the way an old woman does when she has seen enough grief in her life to know that some fires cannot be talked out, only allowed to burn themselves down. Joseph Ford walked to the sheriff's office the following morning, not because he had any plan beyond looking the man in the eye who had hanged his brother, but because a man who has carried a wound for 4 years sometimes needs simply to stand in the room where it happened and see what remains. Silas Langston was behind his desk when Joseph came through the door, an older man now, silver-templed, with the tired eyes of someone who had spent a long career keeping a rough town from tearing itself apart. He looked up, and something in his face changed the moment Joseph gave his name. "Ford," Silas said slowly, setting down his pen. "You'll be kin to Thomas Ford, then?" "His brother," Joseph said. "I've come back to Concho Springs to find out the truth of what happened to him." The office was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at nothing in particular. "The truth," Silas said at last, "is that a jury of this town's own conscience convicted him, and I signed off on what they decided. I won't pretend it sits easy with me, Mr. Ford. It never has." "Then you have doubts," Joseph said, and he heard his own voice sharpen. "You've had doubts all this time, and you never once tried to find out if you were wrong." Silas Langston's jaw tightened, and for a moment Joseph thought the man might rise from behind that desk in anger, but instead he only looked older and smaller and more tired than a man his age should look. "There's not a day gone by," Silas said quietly, "that I haven't thought of that morning. But doubts aren't proof, son, and I've got no proof to offer you, only regret, and regret don't clear a dead man's name." Joseph left the sheriff's office with his hands clenched at his sides and no clearer sense of what to do next than when he had walked in. But as he stepped out onto the boardwalk, he found himself face to face with Irene Langston, who had apparently been standing near the corner of the building longer than was comfortable to explain. "You're Thomas Ford's brother," she said, before he could speak. There was no accusation in her voice, only a quiet certainty, as though she had already worked it out for herself and had only been waiting for the confirmation. "I am," Joseph said carefully, "and you'd be the sheriff's daughter." "I am," she answered, and there was something almost apologetic in the way she said it, as though the fact of her birth were itself a kind of confession. "Mr. Ford, I wonder if you would walk with me a moment. There's something I think you ought to know, and I would rather not say it where my father might hear." Joseph studied her for a long moment. She was younger than he had first supposed, no more than 18 or 19, but there was a steadiness in her gaze that belonged to someone who had carried a weight far longer than her years should have allowed. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." She led him down past the mercantile to a small stand of oak trees at the edge of town, where a split-rail fence marked the boundary of the churchyard, and there she stopped and turned to face him with her hands folded tightly in front of her. "I was 14 years old when they hanged your brother," she said, and her voice trembled slightly on the words, though she did not look away from him. "I stood in that crowd and I watched it happen, Mr. Ford, and I have spent every year since then believing that we hanged an innocent man. I have gathered what I could of the truth, quietly, carefully, because I did not know who else to trust with it, and because I did not know if it would ever matter to anyone besides myself. But you are here now, and I think perhaps it is time I stopped keeping this to myself." Joseph felt something shift in his chest, something between anger and disbelief, and underneath both, a strange and sudden gratitude that he had not expected to feel toward anyone in this town, least of all toward the daughter of the man who had ordered the rope. "Tell me what you know," he said quietly. "All of it." And so, standing beneath the oak trees at the edge of the Concho Springs churchyard, with the summer heat pressing down around them, and a mockingbird singing somewhere in the branches above, Irene Langston told Joseph Ford everything she had gathered in 4 years of careful, quiet listening. She told him about the water rights along Cottonwood Creek, and Garrett Voss's 2 failed offers to buy Thomas's homestead. She told him about Ezra Combs, found shot in the back near the north fence, and the knife that had never been properly tested against the wound. She told him about the way Voss had refused to meet anyone's eyes on the morning of the hanging, and the way, in the years since, he had quietly expanded his herds onto the very land Thomas Ford had died defending. Joseph listened without interrupting, his jaw set tight, his eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder as though he were looking at the whole shape of his brother's death for the first time laid out clean and whole. "You believe Voss did it," he said, when she had finished. "You believe he killed Ezra Combs himself or had it done and let my brother hang for it so he could take the water." "I believe it," Irene said. "I have believed it for years, but believing is not proof, Mr. Ford, and I am only a sheriff's daughter with no authority to compel any man to speak the truth. I have needed someone who has a right to ask these questions, someone the town cannot simply dismiss as a grieving girl chasing shadows." "You've needed someone with a stake in it," Joseph said slowly. "I have needed someone who loved him," Irene answered, and her voice caught slightly on the word. "I never knew your brother, Mr. Ford, not truly, only the sight of his face on the morning he died. But I have carried the guilt of what my father did every day since, and I do not know how to carry it any lighter unless the truth comes out into the light where the whole town can see it." Joseph looked at her for a long moment, and something in him, some hard and guarded thing that had not softened in 4 years of solitary cattle drives and long silent nights under strange stars, began slowly to ease. "Then we'll find the truth together," he said. "I'll not pretend I trust your father, Miss Langston, not after what he did, but I don't hold it against you. A daughter isn't bound to answer for her father's sins, provided she's willing to do something about them." "I am willing," Irene said, and for the first time in 4 years she felt the stone in her chest shift, just slightly, as though it had finally found another set of hands willing to help her carry it. They began, in the weeks that followed, a careful and quiet investigation that neither of them spoke of openly in town, for fear of drawing the attention of Garrett Voss before they had gathered enough to move against him. Irene continued her work at the mercantile and the church, using the trust the town had long placed in her to ask questions that seemed harmless on their surface. Joseph took work at the livery stable, close enough to the old cottonwood stump to remind him daily of what he had come to set right, and he spent his evenings riding out along Cottonwood Creek, studying the lay of the land his brother had died defending. It was on one such evening, in the golden hour before sunset, that Irene rode out to meet him, having told her father only that she meant to visit the widow Prout for supper. She found Joseph sitting on a fallen log near the creek, staring out at the water with an expression she was beginning to recognize as grief wearing the mask of patience. "This was his land," Joseph said, as she came to sit beside him, careful to leave a respectable distance between them, though something in her wanted, foolishly, to close it. "He wrote to me about it once, said the water ran so clear here you could see clean to the bottom even in August, when every other creek for miles had turned to mud. He was proud of it, Miss Langston, prouder than he'd ever been of anything. He sounds as though he was a good man," Irene said softly. "He was the best of us," Joseph said, and his voice roughened. "Our folks died young back in Missouri, and Thomas near raised me himself, though he wasn't but 6 years older. He gave up his own chances more than once so I could have mine, and I wasn't even here when they hanged him. I was 300 miles north driving cattle to a railhead, earning money I meant to send home to help him buy out that second offer from Voss, so he wouldn't have to sell." He shook his head slowly. "By the time I got word, he'd been in the ground 2 months. Irene reached out before she quite decided to and laid her hand over his. "You could not have known," she said. "You cannot carry the blame for being elsewhere, Mr. Ford. That guilt belongs to men who stood in that crowd and said nothing, and to my father who signed the order, and to whoever put that knife in your brother's saddlebag. It does not belong to you." Joseph looked down at her hand on his, and then up at her face, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the creek murmuring past them and the sky turning slowly to the color of a ripe peach above the western hills. "You may call me Joseph," he said finally. "If we're to be partners in this business, I'd as soon not stand on formality." "Then you must call me Irene," she answered, and something like the first hint of a smile touched the corner of her mouth, the first real smile Joseph had seen from her since he had arrived in Concho Springs. They did not speak of it again that evening, the strange new warmth that had crept in between them, but each of them carried it home separately beneath the same darkening sky, turning it over privately, uncertain yet of what to make of a feeling that had arrived, uninvited, in the middle of a mission built on grief. The investigation deepened through the summer months. Irene, using her standing in town, learned from old Doc Whitfield, who had since retired from doctoring but still remembered every case he had ever handled, that he had in fact examined Ezra Combs's body all those years ago, though no one had ever called him to testify at any formal hearing, because there had been no formal hearing at all, only the swift justice of an angry crowd. "The wound troubled me even then," Doc Whitfield admitted, sitting on his porch with a cup of chicory coffee going cold in his hands. "That knife they said Thomas Ford used was a skinning knife, curved blade, short handle. But the wound in Ezra Combs's back was narrow and deep, more like what you get from a Bowie knife or a long-bladed dagger. I said as much to your father at the time, Miss Langston, but the crowd was already worked up something fierce, and your father told me there wasn't time to wait on a proper inquiry, not with feelings running as hot as they were." Irene felt her chest tight. "Did anyone else know this, Doctor?" "I told your father," Whitfield said again, more quietly this time. "I imagine he didn't want to hear it, not with the whole town baying for a hanging. A man can convince himself of near anything when he's afraid of what happens if he don't act." That evening, Irene confronted her father in the kitchen of their small house, the same kitchen where she had grown up watching him grow old with grief he never spoke of. "Doc Whitfield told you the wound didn't match Thomas Ford's knife," she said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, her voice trembling with an anger she had been storing for 4 years. "You knew, Papa. You knew there was doubt, and you let them hang him anyway." Silas Langston sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he had not touched, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "I was afraid," he said. "The town wanted blood, Irene. Voss had half of Concho Springs in his debt one way or another, and when he said Thomas Ford had done it, and Combs's own kin stood there demanding justice. I told myself the doubt wasn't strong enough to stand against all that anger. I told myself I was keeping the peace. He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet, the first tears she had ever seen from her father in her whole life. I have told myself many things these past 4 years, and none of them have ever let me sleep easy. Then help me now, Irene said, coming to kneel beside his chair, her own anger softening into something closer to grief. Help me find the truth, Papa. Help me finish what I started years ago when I was too young to do anything but watch. You cannot undo the hanging, but you can help make certain the whole town knows the truth of what happened, and you can help make certain a man like Garrett Voss never does such a thing again. Silas Langston looked at his daughter for a long, long moment, and something in his face, some old and stubborn pride, finally broke apart like ice on a spring river. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, Irene. I'll help you. God knows it's past time." With her father's quiet cooperation, though he insisted they proceed carefully. For Garrett Voss was still a powerful man with hired guns on his payroll and friends in the Territorial Land Office besides. Irene and Joseph began to draw the threads of their investigation together. Silas, using his authority as sheriff, requested the old land records from the county courthouse in the nearest large town, 2 days' ride south, and there they found what they had hoped and feared to find. A filing, dated only 3 weeks after Thomas Ford's death, in which Garrett Voss had petitioned to absorb the 40 acres along Cottonwood Creek into his own registered holdings, on the grounds that the land had reverted to the territory upon the previous claimant's death without heirs. "Without heirs," Joseph said bitterly, staring at the document in the dim light of the sheriff's office. "He didn't even know I existed, or he didn't care. Either way, he moved awful fast to grab that water once Thomas was in the ground." "Fast is not proof of murder," Silas said carefully, though his voice had none of its old hardness now, only a tired determination to see the thing through properly this time. "We need something that ties him directly to Ezra Combs's death. A witness, a confession, a weapon, something more than a land filing and a doctor's old suspicion." It was Irene who remembered then, a detail she had heard years ago and dismissed as unimportant. That one of Garrett Voss's ranch hands, a young man named Del Prout, nephew to the very widow who ran the boarding house where Joseph now lodged, had left Voss's employ suddenly not long after the hanging, and had never spoken of his reasons to anyone. "He moved out to Amarillo," Irene said. "Mrs. Prout mentioned it once years ago, said her nephew had gone off sudden and never explained why, and it near broke her heart since they'd always been close." "You think he saw something," Joseph said. "I think it's worth finding out," Irene answered. It took another 2 weeks of careful arrangement. Letters sent by Silas under his authority as sheriff requesting Del Prout's cooperation in what he called an ongoing inquiry into an old crime, before Del finally agreed to return to Concho Springs and speak with them. He arrived on a gray, overcast afternoon in late July, a thin, nervous young man of perhaps 25, and he sat in the sheriff's office with his hat twisted in his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes for the first several minutes of the conversation. "I should have said something years ago," Del admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've carried it on my conscience every day since, and I reckon that's part of why I left, because I couldn't stand to look at Mr. Voss knowing what I knew and saying nothing." "Tell us," Silas said gently, no longer the hard-edged lawman of years past, but something closer to a man seeking his own redemption. "Whatever you saw, Del, it's past time it came into the light." Del Prout drew a long breath, and then he told them. He had been riding fence along the north boundary the night Ezra Combs died, and he had seen, from a distance, in the moonlight, Garrett Voss himself arguing with Combs near the very spot where the body was later found. He had not seen the shot fired, for he had turned his horse away, frightened of being caught eavesdropping on his employer's business, but he had heard it, a single crack that carried clear across the flat prairie night, and when he had ridden back toward town the following morning, He had learned that Ezra Combs was dead, and that talk was already spreading of Thomas Ford's guilt. "I knew it wasn't right," Dell said, his voice thick with old shame. "I knew Mr. Voss had been out there that night arguing with Combs, and I knew Thomas Ford's place was a mile off in the other direction. But Mr. Voss was my employer, and I was scared, and by the time I worked up the courage to say something, they'd already strung Ford up, and saying anything after that felt like it wouldn't bring him back, only get me killed for my trouble." "Why do you believe Voss killed Combs?" Joseph asked, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Rather than someone else entirely." "Because 2 days after," Dell said, "I saw Mr. Voss cleaning a long-bladed knife down at the bunkhouse wash basin, scrubbing at it something fierce, like he meant to get every last trace off the steel. It weren't his usual skinning knife. I'd never seen that blade before, and I never saw it again after that day." Irene felt her heart pounding. "A long-bladed knife," she repeated softly, looking at Joseph. "That matches what Doc Whitfield said about the wound." Silas Langston rose slowly from behind his desk, his face grim but resolved. "It's not a full confession," he said, "but it's enough, together with the doctor's testimony and the land records, to bring formal charges and demand a proper hearing before the circuit judge. I'll send word to Fort Worth myself, and this time we'll do it right, with a jury and sworn testimony and every man given his due process, the way it should have been done 4 years ago." Garrett Voss, however, did not intend to wait quietly for a circuit judge to arrive and unravel 4 years of careful, profitable silence. Word of Del Prute's return and his conversation with the sheriff spread through Concho Springs faster than any of them had hoped, carried on the loose tongues of men who drank at the same saloon where Voss's remaining hands still gathered of an evening, and within 2 days, Voss himself came riding into town with 3 armed men at his back, his face set hard beneath the brim of his hat. He found Silas Langston on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, and he did not bother with pleasantries. "I hear you've taken to digging up old graves, Sheriff," Voss said, his voice carrying easily down the quiet street, drawing the attention of shopkeepers and passers-by alike. "I hear you've got some notion that I had a hand in what happened to Ezra Combs, God rest him, and to that thieving squatter who killed him." "Thomas Ford didn't kill anybody," Joseph Ford said, stepping out from the office doorway, his hand resting near, though not upon, the pistol at his hip. "And you know it better than any man alive, Voss, on account of you're the one who did it." Voss's eyes narrowed as they settled on Joseph. "You'll be the brother, then. Come back to stir up trouble over a dead thief who ought to have stayed forgotten." "He was no thief," Irene said, stepping forward from where she had been standing near the mercantile, her chin raised despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. "He was a homesteader who refused to sell you his water rights, and you murdered Ezra Combs and let an innocent man hang for it so you could take the land you couldn't buy honestly." A murmur ran through the small crowd that had begun to gather along the street, and Voss's face darkened with a fury that made his 3 hired men shift uneasily on their horses. "You take the word of a coward who ran off years ago," Voss said, "over the word of a man who's built half this county with his own 2 hands. I've put more into Concho Springs than any of you ever will, Sheriff Langston included." "You've put a dead man in the ground who never did you any wrong," Joseph said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you've spent 4 years growing fat off water that was never rightfully yours. That's what you've put into this county, Voss." For a moment, it seemed the tension in the street might break into violence, Voss's men shifting their hands toward their weapons, the crowd drawing back uneasily, and Irene felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she stepped, without quite meaning to, closer to Joseph's side, as though her presence there might somehow shield him from whatever came next. It was Silas Langston who broke the moment, stepping down from the boardwalk with a steadiness in his bearing that Irene had not seen in him in years, the old lawman's authority settling back over him like a coat he had long set aside but had not forgotten how to wear. "Garrett Voss," he said, his voice carrying clear and hard down the street, "I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Ezra Combs, pending a formal hearing before Judge Harmon Reese of the Circuit Court, who has already been sent for and is expected within the week. You may come peaceably, or you may resist and answer for that besides." "On the word of a coward and a girl with a grudge," Voss spat. "You've got no proof, Langston, and you know it." "I've got a doctor who examined the wound and found it didn't match the knife you all convicted Ford on," Silas said. "I've got land records showing you filed to take that water within weeks of the hanging. And I've got a witness who saw you arguing with Combs the night he died, and cleaning a long knife 2 days after that never once appeared again. It may not satisfy you, Voss, but I reckon it'll satisfy Judge Reese well enough to hold you until a jury decides the rest." Voss's 3 hired men looked at one another, and something in their bearing shifted, the loyalty of hired guns being, as it always was in that country, only as deep as the pay that sustained it. One by one, seeing the gathering crowd and the resolve in the sheriff's face, they lowered their hands away from their weapons, unwilling to draw against a lawman and a town's worth of witnesses over a boss whose crimes were now spilling out into the open light of day. Voss saw the shift in his men's postures, and something in his own face crumpled, the bluster going out of him all at once like air from a punctured bladder. "This is madness," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier hardness. "This is a grieving girl's fancy and a coward's guilty conscience, nothing more. Then you'll have every chance to prove as much before Judge Reese," Silas said. "But you'll do it from a jail cell, Voss, not from the back of that horse." In the end, Garrett Voss came down from his horse without further resistance, his face gray with the particular fury of a powerful man who has just discovered, too late, that his power has limits after all, and Silas Langston led him personally to the same small jail cell that had once, briefly, held Thomas Ford before the crowd had grown too impatient to wait even for that. The week that followed was the longest of Irene's life, longer even than the years of quiet, secret waiting that had come before it. Judge Harmon Reese arrived from Fort Worth on a Thursday afternoon, a spare, gray-haired man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness that had traveled well ahead of him, and he set about the business of a formal hearing with a thoroughness that Concho Springs had sorely lacked 4 years earlier. Doc Whitfield testified to the mismatch between the wound and the weapon. Del Prout testified, his voice shaking but steady, to what he had seen and heard on the night Ezra Combs died. The land records were entered as evidence, showing the suspiciously swift filing that had followed so closely on the heels of Thomas Ford's death. And when Judge Reese pressed Garrett Voss directly, asking him to account for his whereabouts on the night in question, and for the sudden disappearance of a long-bladed knife that several witnesses now recalled having seen in his possession only in that narrow window of time, Voss's composure finally broke entirely, and in the heat of the courtroom, surrounded by the weight of evidence he could no longer deflect, he confessed. He had argued with Ezra Combs that night, he admitted, over Combs's threat to tell the sheriff that Voss had been the one pressuring Thomas Ford, and in a moment of fury, he had drawn his knife and struck before he had fully considered what he was doing. Seeing an opportunity in the panic that followed, and knowing that suspicion would fall easily upon the homesteader who had already refused his offers twice, Voss had planted his own skinning knife, borrowed quietly from a hand who never knew its purpose, in Thomas Ford's saddlebag, and had let the town's fear and fury do the rest of the work for him. The courtroom was silent when he finished speaking, and Irene, sitting beside Joseph in the front row of benches, felt tears sliding down her face that she did not try to stop, tears that were part grief and part something like relief, the strange, aching relief of a truth finally allowed to breathe after 4 long years of suffocation. Judge Reese sentenced Garrett Voss to hang for the murder of Ezra Combs, a sentence that would be carried out properly, with all the process of law that had been denied to Thomas Ford, and separately, in a formal ruling entered into the territorial record, He declared Thomas Ford's conviction wrongful and posthumously exonerated, restoring, insofar as the law was able, the good name that had been stolen from him. It was not, Irene understood, a resolution that could undo the past. Thomas Ford would not rise from his grave along Cottonwood Creek, because a judge in Fort Worth had signed a piece of paper. 4 years of Joseph's grief could not be erased by an official document, any more than 4 years of her own guilt could be washed away by a single afternoon in a courtroom. But it was, at least, the truth laid bare at last, acknowledged by the same town that had once condemned an innocent man without a moment's proper hearing. And there was a kind of justice in that, imperfect and hard one, that Irene had spent half her life hoping to see. Silas Langston resigned his post as sheriff the following month, not in disgrace, for the town had come, in the wake of everything that had happened, to see him as a man who had finally found the courage to correct his own gravest mistake, but because he said simply that he no longer trusted his own judgment enough to hold such power over other men's lives. "Let a younger man carry the star," he told Irene, the evening he turned it over to his deputy. "One who hasn't got an old man's fears clouding his sense of what's right. I've done what I could to make amends, and now I mean to spend what years I've got left trying to live quietly and honestly, and maybe, in time, that'll be enough." Irene had embraced her father then, the first true embrace they had shared in years without the shadow of that October morning standing between them, and she had felt, for the first time since she was 14 years old, that the stone in her chest had finally, truly begun to dissolve. There remained one task before Irene felt the debt of her promise fully paid, and it was Joseph who suggested it, on a quiet evening not long after Voss's sentencing, as they walked together along Cottonwood Creek in the fading light of a late summer sunset. "I mean to put a proper stone on my brother's grave," he said. "Something with his name carved right and the truth beneath it, so any soul passing through this country 100 years from now will know Thomas Ford was an innocent man wrongly killed, and not simply another nameless grave on the prairie. I would like to help you choose the words," Irene said quietly. They found a stonecutter in the next county over, a patient old craftsman who listened carefully to what they wanted and took great care with his work. And 3 weeks later they stood together beside the modest grave along the edge of the churchyard, where Thomas Ford had been buried without ceremony 4 years earlier, and watched as the new stone was set into place. It read simply, "Thomas Ford, beloved brother, wrongfully accused, wrongfully hanged, rightfully cleared. May the truth he was denied in life stand eternal in his memory." Joseph knelt beside the stone for a long while, his hand resting on the cool granite, and Irene stood a respectful distance behind him, giving him the privacy of his grief, until at last he rose and turned to face her, his eyes wet but his shoulders somehow lighter than she had ever seen them. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. For the years you spent believing in the truth when no one else in this town cared to look for it. I don't know that I could have found any of this without you, Irene." "You would have found your way here eventually," Irene said. "You loved him too much not to." "Perhaps," Joseph said, "but I would have found it alone and colder, and I think it would have hardened something in me that I'm grateful now never had the chance to harden." He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the faint gold flecks in his brown eyes catching the last of the evening light. "I did not come to Concho Springs looking for anything besides the truth about my brother's death, Irene. I want you to know that. But I have found something else here besides, something I was not looking for and did not expect, and I find I am no longer able to imagine riding on from this town without it." Irene felt her breath catch in her throat, and she did not look away from him, though her heart was pounding so hard she thought surely he must be able to hear it in the quiet evening air. "What have you found, Joseph?" she asked softly, though she thought perhaps she already knew, and hoped with a fierceness that surprised her that she was not wrong. "You," he said simply. "I have found you, Irene Langston, and I find that I love you, more than I ever expected to love anyone again after everything this town cost me. I do not know if it is too soon to say such a thing, standing here beside my brother's grave, but I find I cannot hold it inside myself any longer." Irene closed the distance between them before he had even finished speaking, and when their lips met, it was gentle at first, tentative, as though both of them were still testing the shape of this new and unexpected joy against the long grief that had brought them together. And then it deepened, and Irene felt something in her chest finally, fully unclench, the last of the stone she had carried since she was 14 years old dissolving away entirely into the warm evening air. "I love you too," she whispered, when at last they drew apart. "I believe I have loved you since the evening you told me about the water running clear all the way to the bottom of the creek, though I did not have the courage to name it until just now." Joseph laughed then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the first she had heard from him since his arrival in Concho Springs, and he took her hand in his and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Then let us not waste any more time being cowardly about it," he said. "Irene Langston, will you marry me? I have no grand fortune to offer you, only 40 acres along a creek that runs clear to the bottom even in August, and whatever love I have left in me after 4 years of grief, which I promise you is a good deal more than I thought I had left to give." "Yes," Irene said, without a single moment's hesitation, tears of joy now mingling freely with the tears of old grief still drying on her cheeks. "Yes, Joseph, I will marry you, and gladly, and I will help you build something new on that land, something worthy of your brother's memory." They were married the following spring, in the small church at the edge of Concho Springs, with the whole town in attendance, for the story of Thomas Ford's wrongful hanging and the long, patient work of setting it right had become, in the months since, something the town spoke of with a kind of somber pride, proof that even a place with a shameful history could find its way, eventually, toward something like redemption. Silas Langston walked his daughter down the short aisle himself, his eyes wet with tears he no longer bothered to hide, and when he placed her hand in Joseph's, he leaned close and spoke words meant only for the two of them. "I could not undo what I did," he said quietly. "But I thank God every day that my daughter had the courage to try, and that she found in you a man worthy of finishing what she started. Take care of her, Joseph. She has carried more than her share of this family's burdens, and she deserves nothing but joy from here forward." "I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain of it," Joseph said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. They built their home along Cottonwood Creek, on the very land Thomas Ford had died defending, and Joseph often said, in the years that followed, that he could feel his brother's presence there still, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as a kind of quiet blessing settled over the water and the fields, as though Thomas had known, somehow, that his sacrifice would not be entirely in vain. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Joseph proved as skilled with cattle as he had been with the long drives north to Kansas, and Irene proved a shrewd manager of the small enterprise's books and trade. And within 3 years, they had built a modest but comfortable house, with a wide porch facing west toward the setting sun, and a barn sturdy enough to weather the fierce Texas winds that came howling down from the panhandle each winter. Their first child, a son, was born in the autumn of 1881, and they named him Thomas, after the uncle he would never meet but whose memory would shape the whole of his family's history. Joseph wept the first time he held his son, overwhelmed by a joy so large it frightened him, and he whispered into the baby's small ear a promise that he would grow up knowing the truth of his uncle's story, knowing that justice, however delayed, however hard won, was always worth fighting for. Their second child, a daughter, arrived 2 years later, and Irene insisted on naming her Grace, for the grace that had finally been extended to a man long dead and long wronged, and for the grace, too, that she felt had been extended to her own weary heart after so many years of carrying guilt that had never truly been hers to carry alone. Silas Langston lived to see both grandchildren grow into sturdy, laughing toddlers who adored their grandfather's gentle stories, and his patient way of teaching them to whittle small wooden animals from scraps of cottonwood, the same tree, ironically and perhaps fittingly, that had once borne such terrible weight and now, in its descendants scattered along the creek, gave shade and shelter to a family built from its shadow. He never fully forgave himself for what he had done, Irene knew, but he found, in his final years, a measure of peace in watching his daughter's happiness, and in the quiet, steady work of atonement that had come to define the last chapter of his life. He spent much of his remaining time helping other towns in the territory establish proper procedures for circuit court hearings, traveling sometimes for weeks at a stretch to speak before town councils about the dangers of hasty justice, determined that no other family should suffer what the Fords had suffered, because a frightened town could not wait for the truth. Del Prout, whose courage in finally speaking the truth had done so much to unravel Voss's crime, remained in Concho Springs afterward, welcomed back by his aunt and, in time, by the town itself, which had come to see his confession not as the tardy admission of a coward but as the brave correction of an old wrong. He married a young schoolteacher 2 years later and remained, for the rest of his life, a close friend to both Joseph and Irene, often riding out to the ranch along Cottonwood Creek to share a meal and reminisce, in careful, gentle terms, about the strange, sorrowful, and ultimately redemptive turn their lives had all taken together. Garrett Voss was hanged that autumn properly before witnesses, with a circuit judge's signature and a jury's careful verdict behind the sentence. And though Irene felt no joy in another man's death, she felt, standing at the edge of the crowd with Joseph's hand tight around her own, a quiet and solemn sense that the scales, so badly tipped for so many years, had finally been brought back into balance. The old cottonwood stump behind the livery stable remained for many years, a silent marker of the town's darkest hour, until finally, on the 10th anniversary of Thomas Ford's death, the town council of Concho Springs voted to plant a new sapling in its place, a young cottonwood grown from a cutting taken, at Joseph's suggestion, from the very trees that lined the banks of the creek where Thomas Ford had once dreamed of building a life. Joseph and Irene attended the planting together, their 2 children beside them, Thomas now a sturdy boy of 9 and Grace a bright, curious girl of 7. And as the young tree was set into the earth, the whole town gathered in a silence that was, for once, not the silence of fear or bloodlust, but the quiet, solemn silence of remembrance and hard-earned wisdom. "Someday," Joseph said to Irene, as they watched the townspeople file past to lay their hands briefly against the young sapling's slender trunk, a custom that had sprung up unplanned and unbidden, born simply of the town's collective need to touch something growing where once only death had stood. "Someday this tree will stand taller than either of us, and folks will walk past it without knowing all that it means. But we'll know, and we'll teach our children to know, and they'll teach theirs, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how a wrong this size finally gets put right, not all at once, but a little more with every year that passes." "It is enough," Irene said, leaning her head against his shoulder, watching their children laugh together as they ran toward the creek's edge, chasing a dragonfly that flitted low over the clear water. "It took me my whole childhood and half my growing years to make it right, Joseph, and I would not change a single hour of the sorrow that led me here, because it led me, in the end, to you." They stood together a long while in the fading afternoon light, the creek running clear all the way to its bottom, just as Thomas Ford had once described it in a letter that arrived 2 months too late, the new sapling standing slender and hopeful where a symbol of injustice had once cast its long shadow, and the whole of Concho Springs settling slowly, imperfectly, but truly, into a peace it had spent a decade learning how to earn. In the years that followed, Irene and Joseph welcomed a 3rd child, a 2nd son they named Silas, after the grandfather who had spent his final years working tirelessly to ensure no other town would repeat his gravest mistake, and Silas Langston lived just long enough to hold his tiny namesake in his arms before he passed quietly in his sleep one winter evening, having finally, Irene believed with her whole heart, found forgiveness, both from his daughter and from himself. The ranch along Cottonwood Creek prospered, its water rights secure and undisputed, its herds growing steadily under Joseph's careful management, and its house filled always with the warm, easy laughter of a family that had been built, quite literally, from the ashes of tragedy, but had chosen, deliberately and with great courage, to grow something lasting and good in its place. Irene often told her children as they grew older the story of the innocent man who had been wrongly hanged so many years before, not to burden them with old grief, but because she believed, with the same fierce conviction that had driven her since she was 14 years old standing in a frightened crowd, that the truth, once buried, must always eventually be brought back into the light, no matter how long it takes, no matter how much courage it demands, and that love, real and patient and unwavering, was very often the force that made such a reckoning possible. She would sit with them beneath the young cottonwood tree, now grown tall and broad after so many years, its leaves whispering in the same prairie wind that had once carried the sound of a creaking rope, and she would tell them of a young drifter named Thomas Ford who had loved a piece of land enough to die for it, and of the brother who had crossed half of Texas to clear his name, and of her own long years of quiet, patient watching, and she would finish, always, the same way. "Never let fear decide what is true," she would tell them, her hand resting gently on whichever small shoulder happened to be nearest. "Fear is loud and it moves fast, and it will convince a whole town to do a terrible thing before the sun has even fully risen. But the truth is patient, and it is strong, and if you are willing to spend however long it takes chasing after it, you will find that it is always, in the end, worth the years it costs you." And on quiet evenings, when the children had gone to bed, and the ranch house settled into the particular hush of a Texas prairie night, Joseph would take her hand on the wide porch facing west, and they would watch the same stars that had once guided cattle drives and lonely riders across half a continent. And Irene would think, with a gratitude that never dimmed no matter how many years passed, that she had spent her childhood watching an injustice she could not stop, and had spent the rest of her life, gladly and without regret, undoing it, one patient year at a time, until at last it had led her home, to a man who had loved his brother enough to seek the truth, and had come in the seeking to love her too, fully and forever, exactly as she was.